Well, in 2008-9, I was part of a research project called Tales of Return, the memories and experiences of Spanish migrants and exiles in France and the UK from the 1950s to the 1990s. This was a project that wanted to look at the concept of return migration, or why migrants did not return, just to look at the whole dynamics of return. So we carried out a series of interviews with migrants in France, the UK, different parts of Spain, and collected this material, these life history recordings, wrote a paper for an academic journal, and moved on to the next project. So we forgot about this data until, of course, we met all the team in the OpenLIVES project. People from the Language and Linguistic and Area Studies Center contacted us with the idea of OpenLIVES. And yeah, and that's it. I brought all the data that we had collected, and I started working with people from Leeds and Portsmouth on how to develop this material pedagogically and how to disseminate it to the wider community. For me, really, this has been a point of arrival rather than a point of departure. It has been a point of arrival in the sense that from the beginning of my academic career, going back to the years of my PhD, a long time ago, but especially since I started working at a university here in Southampton, I had been in a way piloting this model of work in which narratives, life history narratives, had a central role. Working with migrants, working with former evacuee children of the Spanish Civil War. I have been teaching content courses that looked at issues of migration, how migration and exile are documented, are narrated, analyzing these discourses. And I have always involved the students, and whenever possible, the migrants themselves. So in my classroom, the classroom became a space for a dialogue to be had between the migrants, the students, and myself, as a facilitator rather than a lecturer. The learning took place within that dialogue. So I had been working like this with the students, with the migrants, and also with my colleague Irina Nelson, who is also part of the project, who was a language tutor. Together, we started mixing language and content in this narrative way. In this department, in the university where I work, there has always been a division at curricular level and professional level between language teaching and content teaching. I've never understood the sense of that. For me, as for my colleague, these two aspects of studying modern languages had to be integrated. And migration, migrant life stories enabled us to do this. But of course, we did little experiments here and there. We wrote reports about how we were mixing our content and our language. The institution looked at it with interest, but dismissed it mostly. There was no real interest in challenging the curricular structure. So this was a little bit disappointing, but we still persevered, and increasingly we collaborated more and more in this respect. I got funding for various projects, including the one I've just mentioned, the Tales of Return, and continued to work like this. Being part of OpenLIVES, working with Kate, with Ali, with Antonio, with Miguel. For me, as an educator, as a researcher, as an oral history practitioner, has meant endorsement of this model of work. It has meant that I was not crazy, that I was not, that what I was doing was right. It had a purpose, it had to be done. And the way in which, instead of a point of arrival, it has been a point of departure, has been the way I've learned what can be done with the material other than writing academic papers in peer-reviewed journals. What can be done pedagogically? That has been the learning for me. I mean, I've been inspired by concepts such as students as producers, which originally coined by Professor Mike Neary, brought to me by Antonio in the team from Leeds. Antonio's concept of the global learning community. Kate's idea of the democratization of education. And those are now the principles and the values that will guide my future work, whether I work in an institution or whether I work with communities. In terms of the issues and the questions that OpenLIVES has raised for me, a very important one is the whole idea of consent and ethics, which is closely linked to my attachment to this data that we had in the original corpus of interviews. I was worried that in order to fulfill the requirements of GISCs, the institutional requirements for the release of the data, we had to make sure that the consent forms were okay, that the consent was continued, and that the informants that we had interviewed now 3-4 years earlier were happy with this. Now, this was one of the complexities for me, one of the big issues, and I was very opposed to the idea of contacting them again. I saw this as disturbing them, as confusing them, as creating unnecessary work that might prejudice them. But I think that in the end, it worked out okay. And what was very, very beautiful for me was to see how my colleagues re-engage with some of these informants who felt validated, who felt that the original motivation to share the stories was being realized, was taking place. The stories were going to be disseminated, and they knew, they were going to know where they were going to happen. So this was something that I learned, and in a way, it was a way of seeing the data go off and take off in its own right, and me as the kind of mother of the original data, of letting go and being happy with where the data was going. I think that was very important for me. Of course, linked to this, I've learned that for the future project, a lot of preparation work has to be done before you go to the field, before you interview people and explain what's going to happen with the stories in the new digital era. It's not just about depositing materials the old traditional way in a library. It is more complex than that. But that is the beauty of it. Is the World Wide Web. It is part of that ethos of democratizing education, of giving open access. We've been talking so far about the so what of this project, but the next big question is, where do we go next with this? How do we consolidate this model of work in which the students are equals to us as researchers, in which we are no longer lecturers, we are facilitators, and we have a responsibility with that global learning community to make sure that these stories continue traveling. How do we ensure the sustainability of the project? Migration and exile continue to mark the lives of many people. How do we study the next waves of migration in the Spanish-speaking world, in other worlds? So I guess this is going to keep us very busy in months to come.